At the White House, Coolidge gave strict orders to Chief Usher Ike Hoover. "I want things as they used to be before," he said. The resulting transformation was the difference between an Ohio speakeasy and a New England church supper. Among his first acts as president, this repressed but deeply emotional Vermonter wrote a letter to a Northampton shoemaker and Democrat named Jim Lucy, with whom he had forged a deep, if unlikely, friendship. "Dear Mr. Lucy," began the president, "not often do I see or write you, but I want you to know that if it were not for you, I should not be here, and I want to tell you how much I love you. Do not work too much now, and try to enjoy yourself in your well-earned leisure of years." From his first hours in the White House, Coolidge would prove a thoroughly unconventional president. Shrewd and sentimental, calculating and dutiful, Coolidge shunned the glad handing of his chosen profession. Unlike most of his fellow citizens, who maintain a tolerant disregard for politicians, providing they don't get above themselves, Coolidge was openly scornful of the political mind. Men in public life, he said, had been twice spoiled. Quote, "They have been spoiled with praise, and they have been spoiled with abuse. With them, nothing is natural. Everything is artificial." Far from the tool of big business often portrayed, Coolidge refused to recognize the Soviet Union despite pleas from entrepreneurs who envisioned fortunes to be made in the Russian market. He was confident that the Marxist experiment was doomed. "Communism will fail," he predicted, "because what it attempts is against human nature. No man will provide me with food and other necessities of life unless he is a gainer by it." None of this impressed cafe society, which sneered at Coolidge and the culture that produced him. Alice Roosevelt Longworth famously observed that the president looked as if he had been weaned on a pickle. When Coolidge opened his mouth, it was claimed, a moth flew out. And who can forget Dorothy Parker's immortal wisecrack, as cruel as it was tasteless, on being informed of Coolidge's death in 1933? How could they tell? In fact, there were personal as well as political reasons for his reticence. It had been said of the radiant Grace Coolidge, formerly a teacher at Northampton's Clark School for the Deaf, that having made the deaf to hear, she might yet coax the dumb to speak. In truth, her husband's silences were at least partly intended to conserve his dwindling energy, for Coolidge was already, by the summer of 1923, suffering symptoms of the heart disease that would end his life at the age of 60. On one occasion, Bernard Baruch expressed amazement that the private Coolidge was so unlike his reputation as the Great Stone Face. "Well, Baruch," replied the president, "many times I say only yes or no to people. Even that is too much. It winds them up for 20 minutes more." It's a nice story, on a par with the oft-told chestnut that has Coolidge returning from church, only to have Grace inquire into the subject of the youthful minister's public eloquence. Asked the subject of his sermon, Coolidge replies, "Sin." An exasperated Grace demands to know what the preacher had to say on this perennially fascinating topic. "He was against it," replies Coolidge in his best deadpan manner. As Grace was the first to acknowledge, the story was too good to be true. But it is not without point. Shrewd as ever, Coolidge cultivated an image as Silent Cal for reasons which have as much to do with political cover as with a personal timidity that perhaps represented his greatest failing as a politician. All his life, Coolidge did battle with paralyzing shyness. As a boy in Plymouth, the sound of strangers being entertained by his parents in the kitchen had frozen him in his tracks. For the adult Coolidge, an introvert in an extrovert's profession, greeting their counterparts on the campaign trail required an act of will. In time, he conquered his crippling reserve. Quote, "But every time I meet a stranger, I've got to go through the old kitchen door back home, and it's not easy." His reserve was matched by his canniness. Denied the usual political gifts, Coolidge created a public persona that held the world at bay, while allowing him to indulge a humor that was sharp as Vermont cheddar. For politicians, laughter has multiple uses. It can express a genuine whimsy, with which Coolidge was generously endowed. It can also deflect those who come too near or probe too deeply. No less an authority than Will Rogers said of Coolidge that he wasted more humor on folks than almost anybody. Over the years, he developed his silent act into a running joke, a fierce, funny individuality cackling at pretense. If you don't say anything, he once remarked, you won't be called on to repeat it. Hoping to fill a long silence with small talk, one visitor to the White House looked out the window one soggy afternoon and noted, "I wonder if it will ever stop raining." "Well," replied Coolidge, "it always has." Many Coolidge stories have the tang of self-parody. Urged to increase spending on military aviation, the president asked his cabinet, "Why can't we just buy one airplane and have all the pilots take turns?" Having nurtured his reputation for thrift in words and dollars, Coolidge made it work for him. Voters took an instant liking to this prim, dignified Yankee who hated wasted lives even more than wasted dollars. They rubbed their eyes over a public servant whose response to his election as governor of Massachusetts was to exchange his $1 a day room at the Adams House for 2 rooms costing $2 a day. There was no dignity, Coolidge liked to say, quite so great as living within your means. Unbought and unbossed, when presented a copy of the intimate papers of Colonel House, the president pointedly told his would-be sponsor, Frank Stearns, a Boston merchant, popularly known as Lord Lingerie, that an unofficial advisor to a president of the United States is not a good thing. "Did I ever try to advise you?" said Stearns. "No," replied Coolidge, "but I thought I'd better tell you anyway." For good measure, Coolidge angrily returned a check for $5,000 that Stearns had tried to present him as a gift. He also, by the way, offered to build the president a marble mausoleum in Plymouth Notch. Needless to say, that didn't happen. In modern terms, Coolidge was a control freak. He prohibited his wife from driving, horseback riding, flying in an airplane, bobbing her hair, or wearing slacks. He chose her hats, great monstrosities, huge picture hats that she hated, but she had no choice but to wear. He also bought her dresses. He had slightly better taste. And there, money was no object. Very interesting. He would conserve on anything except Grace's wardrobe. Finally, one morning over breakfast, the First Lady rebelled. She knew nothing of her own engagements, she complained. Couldn't the Secret Service prepare each day a list of the coming week's programs, she asked. A reasonable request. Coolidge peered over the top of his newspaper. "Grace," he remarked, "we don't give out that information promiscuously." Once asked how he got his exercise, the president slyly replied, "Having my picture taken." In fact, at various times, he let photographers depict him wearing cowboy chaps, a Boy Scout getup, farming overalls, and full Sioux Indian regalia. "Oh, Mammy," he told his wife, "they're making a perfect fool out of me." On second thought, he concluded that presidential dignity could be overrated. "After all," said the dour Yankee, "it's good for people to laugh." Somewhat contradictorily, he also observed, famously, that he always figured the American people wanted a solemn ass for president, so I went along with him. To most Americans in the 1920s, Coolidge was more than a character. He was character. Admirers savored his comment after being sworn in as vice president. Quote, "I don't feel half as important as I did on the day I graduated from Black River Academy." They chuckled approvingly over his exchange with the senator who pointed at the White House one day and asked its current occupant who lived there. "Nobody," said Coolidge, "they just come and go."